Released at the close of 1975, Radioactivity was a very different record from Autobahn. Around a concept combining both the themes of nuclear energy and the radio itself, Kraftwerk delivered an album of shorter tracks with a more accomplished and polished use of the new technology available to them.
Certainly with Radioactivity, you get to the point where Kraftwerk are operating in, as it were, smaller sound units. It's a very sort of conceptually very self-contained album. It's dispensed entirely with the early Krautrock habit of going off on sort of lengthy, meandering jams. They're working in a sort of almost, sort of, I won't say proto-pop format, but proto the kind of pop that they helped give rise to. And I think that has to do with the fact that they're kind of, as it were, they brought the whole thing in-house. They're working on themselves. In terms of the sort of the personnel working there, they've got like the kind of that four-way division of labour, anything like that. Even though Ralph Hutter and Florian Schneider are obviously very much to the fore. And yes, and it does feel as it is produced under some sort of aesthetic factory conditions all of a sudden.
It's a very poetic record utilizing this the art form of a radio play. Actually, it's sort of a radio play, and listening to pieces like Antenna or Om Sweet Om, it's really very much on the surface. It has got this German soul, a lot of it, or this romantic feeling.
And the album also pushed Kraftwerk's sound into new areas, with the conventional instrumentation of their earlier records discarded. Like Stockhausen before them, the band were moving into entirely electronic territory.
Pure electronics element on Radioactivity is, pretty discernible right from the very beginning, because of the reason they were using all this electronic equipment and had sort of totally done away with orthodox instrumentation like the flute and the drums and everything else like that. Everything had been turned electronic. So this was a new turning point for them, really. They were interested in purely machine-made music, and this is where the bare bones of the next stage of the Kraftwerk sound would begin.
A key instrument in their evolving sound was the Vaiko Orchestra, a 1975 synthesizer that was never mass-produced and which broadened Kraftwerk's sound palette.
Basically, the orchestra, to me, it sounds like the mellotron, but it has got this infinite loops. A mellotron had just a finite. The loops stopped after 20 seconds, so you had to only play just short notes. Listen to Strawberry Fields. But I remember Florian, or Ralph and Florian, they went to this music fair in Frankfurt. And there was suddenly just one of the a part of the exhibitions there, and she just immediately bought it because it had just the this strange old-fashioned gramophone sound of recordings, Edison type of 1867. Yeah, to me it was always sort of mellotron, and it was functioning on. They had just acetate discs or plastic discs. And they had different loops, infinite loops going on. But the best were apparently strings, which went on to Trans-Europe Express, and choir, which went on to Radioactivity.
And as with Autobahn, this title track was both accessible and melodic, and proved the Kraftwerk were able to produce commercial material.
It's sung in English for the first time, so they start singing in English, and it sounds like a pop track. It's so consonant, and it glides along. Bops along very well. They say Radioactivity. But remember, the radio was such an important part of German culture, particularly, see this again, they're addressing the war. People used to cluster around the radio in Germany, and every day, every night, to hear what Hitler was going to say. Like the way they clustered around the radio in the UK to hear what Churchill was going to say. There was a part of that as well in the concert. You were looking backwards to look forwards kind of thing. And the whole thing as a concert, in some ways, they use oscillators and they use a lot of electronic devices. In some ways, it's quite a austere record. The title track may be melodic and hummable, but the rest of it isn't. And it's very much it's a brave thing to do after Autobahn, because some of it isn't even consonant, some of it is just experimental, sounds only. But there is a wistfulness to it, I think, and also there's also a certain humour that the actual album cover looks like a radio, and the whole thing has a concept. And they're honing they're now getting that each album is about something modern but different. So you got an album about driving, and they got an album about radios, and what's next to come. So there is that feeling that they're actually doing something else here. This band are just doing something totally different.
And just as Kraftwerk were now operating outside of any school or movement, the German scene itself had essentially disintegrated.
I think by the mid-70s, the idea of talking about this kind of, as it were, almost autonomous thing called Krautrock is become less and less valid. I mean, the groups, some of the early groups had just fallen away by the wayside. They were just very much of their time. And then other groups have kind of gone on to forge, as it were, careers themselves, again, some sort of measure of international recognition. They've achieved what was probably the initial dream of getting the hell out of Germany. And each is a kind of recognisable entity going off in a different direction in their own right. I mean, groups like Neu are probably at the height of their powers in 1975 with A Music. I mean, although they were always a slightly combustible affair, Kraftwerk are very much kind of, very much set out on the road. Can actually, or in fact, they'd only got sort of a couple more years left in them, although they were enjoying a sort of quite significant measure of success at that time. So yes, I think by that point it would be completely inappropriate to talk all the kind of krautrockers down and the whole krautrock scene, krautrocking together. It really wasn't like that.
Yet it was just at this point that the scene received its most emphatic endorsement. Both ex-Roxy Music member Brian Eno and the chameleonic pop icon David Bowie had been drawn to the distinctive sounds emerging from Germany, and that interest would in part lead them to begin working together in late 1976 on a series of albums that would bring this experimentalism to the mainstream.
In the mid-1970s and late 70s, both Eno and Brian and David Bowie came to a kind of crisis in their lives. Eno was making records in the UK that people weren't really interested in, and he wasn't getting much recognition, even though he was doing a lot of production work and working with a lot of other bands. He felt he needed to do something that would have a wider audience. David Bowie, for his part, was out of glam, was floundering in the US of A. He had made Young Americans and was then making Station to Station. At the time of Station to Station, he was basically drowning in a sea of drugs and decadence there, so he decided to move to Switzerland first. And there he met Eno, and it was, Eno came to see him, and the most important thing about that meeting was they both had similar listening tastes. They were both listening to Neu, they were both very fond of Rodelius and Mobius and that cluster thing, but also they were listening to Kraftwerk, and they felt that there was more happening in the German thing for new music, and new possibilities were opening up much wider there than anywhere else in the world. So they decided that they would do something in 1977 in Germany.
Whereas Bowie was in part escaping from his excesses, Eno had already been making his mark in experimental music, and the move to Germany seemed like a natural progression. Having created the album No Pussyfooting with guitarist Robert Fripp in 1973, which incorporated tape delay techniques similar to those used by the Germans, he set up the Obscure Records label in '75 to release both his and other composers' experimental works. His albums Another Green World and Discrete Music both developed a sound that would eventually be labeled electronic ambient music. And this interest in new experimental forms brought him into contact with Cluster and their collaboration with ex-Kraftwerk guitarist Michael Rother, named Harmonia. Having lost Konrad Schnitzler and altered the spelling of their name in the early 70s, Cluster had persevered in their unique noise experiments through the first half of the decade. After moving to the rural village of Forst in 1973, they teamed up with Rother to record 2 albums as Harmonia, both of which introduced a more structured rhythmical and melodic element into the trademark Cluster sound. Drawn to the output of both ensembles, Eno traveled to Germany before Bowie, first to work with Harmonia and later with Cluster, and although initially he was looking to produce the bands, it soon became a more organic, collaborative process.
He found out that he can't produce Harmonia, neither Harmonia or Cluster, because it was not possible. He tried to do it. He tried to guide us in his direction, of course, because he's a great producer. But he always said, please stay in your way, do what you want to do. Don't listen to producers. Produce yourself, produce your music yourself. It's the best thing you can do and you will be successful with it. And that's what I learned from him, especially for my solo music. We made our living because Cluster never came to break even with their products. And at sudden, with these 2 products with Brian, we got more attention, of course, and we got some money for it because they sold about 50,000 from each. That's a lot. At the time, it was a lot. I mean, not in 1 year, over 10, 15 years. And then By This River, this special song on his Before and After Science record, because he got this golden part, this song was used in films and so we're still living from this music.
But where Cluster and Harmonia had been keen on collaboration, Kraftwerk were less forthcoming. Bowie had initially asked them to join him for his station-to-station tour as a support act, but they declined the offer. And although they were scheduled to record together, it never materialized. Nevertheless, released in January 1977, the first of Bowie and Eno's collaborations, Low, would bring experimental electronic music to a wider audience.
What's incredible about Low is the second side. I think the second side of Low is probably responsible for my sitting here. It's certainly responsible for an enormous amount of people starting to listen to experimental music. I would say without the second side of Low, the vast rock audience, the vast amount of people who are interested in rock music would never have heard Steve Reich, Terry Riley, or even some of this German electronica, because it was basically a portal, into all of this world. And it was such a brave thing to do, because it was basically extremely, it had this coldness to it as well, and this kind of, aridness to it, and it seemed to be devoid of something, and some of it was a deathly sound, but it was fascinating because it was such a brave thing to do. Tony Visconti produced Low, let's get this straight, and Eno was there, assisting and stuff. If Eno wasn't there, I don't think Bowie would have been able to get away with putting this on the second side, because Eno was there. It changed the whole dynamics of the thing. And it was it put him more in a kind of, in the same frame as Kraftwerk and those bands. It seemed to be the one trumpeting this music worldwide.
And with the release of the second of Bowie's trilogy later in 1977, the singer managed to capture the totally alien world of the divided Berlin. While in the UK, punk music laid waste to the dominant rock scene that had been becoming progressively overblown throughout the decade, with Heroes, not only did Bowie raise the profiles of the musicians of Germany, but also of lives outside of the typical Anglo-American experience. And this, in turn, would influence a new generation of musicians.